Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Today, if you get a suspended sentence instead of prison time, or, if a child is placed in a family foster care system instead of some cold institutional workhouse, you can actually trace that reality back to a very specific, chaotic moment in Victorian London.
Yeah, it's an incredible origin story.
It really is. I mean, we are looking at how a group of amateur street-level volunteers quite literally invented the modern social safety net, basically out of the mud.
Right.
I have a massive stack of source material right here, and it's all anchored by Kathleen Heasman's exhaustive text, Evangelicals in Action, an appraisal of their social work in the Victorian era.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is, well, we really want to uncover how the bleak, desperately poor slums of 19th century England gave birth to professional social welfare.
Exactly. And, the real value of this source material is that it completely strips away that sterile top-down view of history. Because we often assume that our modern safety nets were, logically designed by government bureaucrats sitting in pristine offices.
Yeah.
But Heasman's research provides this meticulously documented, really a boots-on-the-ground account of what William Booth called the submerged tenth of the population.
Submerged tenth.
Right.
It tracks the raw, street-level origins of everyday concepts like probation, citizens' advice bureaus, culturally competent social work, all driven by this massive grassroots explosion of evangelical charity.
So if you've ever wondered how society transitioned from throwing debtors in prison to actually trying to rehabilitate them, this is the story of the people who forced that change. So let's unpack this, because if we're going to understand the rescue, we really have to look closely at the mechanics of the crisis.
We do.
I mean, if you picture yourself walking into London in the mid-19th century, the scale of the systemic collapse is just staggering.
It's completely unprecedented. We are looking at a society undergoing a really violent shift. Because for centuries, the British population was primarily rural. It was agrarian. Right, small villages.
Exactly. But suddenly, driven by the engine of the Industrial Revolution and, the promise of factory wages, you have this absolute tidal wave of families flooding into the cities. I mean, in the first 50 years of the 19th century, the population of England doubled.
Wow.
And then in the next 50 years, it nearly doubled again.
Which is insane, because the infrastructure of these cities simply wasn't designed to absorb millions of new bodies.
Not at all.
These were first-generation city dwellers, right? Arriving with village mindsets, expecting village social relationships, and instead they just hit the brick wall of the industrial metropolis.
Yeah, and every available piece of land was built upon with zero authorized municipal control. The architectural reality of this is, well, it's fascinating and horrifying at the same time.
Yeah, the source goes into detail about the rookeries.
Right, the rookeries. Because the wealthier classes began moving out to the newly expanding suburbs to escape the smog. So they left behind these grand old houses in the city centers. And landlords, looking to maximize profit, just chopped these houses up. They divided rooms and then subdivided them again, creating these rookeries in areas like St. Giles, Whitechapel, Bethnal Green.
Right.
These weren't just crowded neighborhoods. They were veritable rabbit warrens.
Yeah, and Thomas Beams wrote a deeply analytical account of this back in 1850. He noted that the subdivision went so far that you didn't just have one family per floor.
No.
You have multiple families per room. He described people literally drawing chalk lines on the floor to mark their territory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, with complete strangers thrown together in a chance scramble for a night's lodging. And if you read the account by the French critic Hippolyte Taine, who visited an area in Shadwell in the late 1860s, the sensory details are just overwhelming.
He called it a human sewer, didn't he?
He did. He called the area a human sewer. And his observations give us the visceral texture of that poverty. He wasn't just noting the architecture, he was observing the psychological breakdown of the population.
Yeah, that environment was functioning as a pressure cooker.
Exactly. He writes about navigating these narrow streets of black brick, the air thick with coal smoke, and seeing the sheer volume of beggars, thieves, and prostitutes crowding the alleys. He hears this grating music bleeding out from underground spirit cellars. He looks through open windows and just sees unmade beds and people dancing in this sort of desperate frenzy.
It's just constant chaos.
Right. And within a 10-minute span, he watches 3 separate crowds gather to cheer on brutal street fights, mostly between women. He describes one woman, drunk and bleeding, screaming with a sharp, grating voice, trying to fling herself at a man while the bystanders just treat it as theater.
And, that pressure was highly damaging to the children.
Oh, absolutely.
The journalist Henry Mayhew conducted extensive investigations into this, and he was particularly focused on the psychological impact of the penny gaffs.
The penny gaffs, right. What were those exactly?
Yeah. So these were cheap abandoned shops that got converted into makeshift music halls. For a single penny, you could get a cheap drink and see performances. And Mayhew, who was a man who spent years documenting the absolute worst of London, he was utterly disgusted by the obscenity in these places.
Yeah, he viewed it almost like an epidemiological crisis, didn't he?
He really did. He described performers actively degrading themselves, forcing concepts into the brains of the childish audience that would embitter and warp them for a lifetime. He actually likened the moral decay he saw there to a bodily infirmity being passed systematically from parent to child.
Wow. And this totally creates the context for William Booth's concept of the submerged 10th, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. We often talk about the Victorian working class, but Booth was categorizing a layer of society that was completely underwater.
Right.
These were people sleeping on the streets or in these foul, unregulated lodging houses that functioned as breeding grounds for cholera and typhus.
And if we look at the underlying economic engine trapping these people, it wasn't simply that wages were low, it was the erratic nature of the labor market.
Yeah, the casual labor.
Right. A massive portion of employment in the East End was casual labor at the docks or in the sweatshops. So if a trade depression hit, or even if the wind just blew the wrong way and ships couldn't come up the Thames, thousands of people were instantly out of work.
Instantly. And the concept of a savings account just didn't exist for the submerged 10th.
Obviously not.
The primary banking system of the slums was the pawn shop. The pawn shop operated as a localized microloan center. So a family's possessions, like a winter coat, a pair of boots, a flat iron, would go in and out of hock on a weekly basis just to generate the copper coins needed to buy Tuesday's bread.
It was an economy living entirely on the razor's edge.
Completely.
So we have this explosive demographic crisis, widespread psychological trauma, and millions living on the brink of starvation. If you are studying public administration today, you immediately ask, what is the government doing?
Right, where is the state?
Exactly. And reading the historical record, the state wasn't just looking the other way. They were actively designing the system to be hostile.
Yeah, the government's entire approach to poverty was governed by the Elizabethan Poor Law, which underwent a really radical philosophical reform in 1834.
Yeah.
And the new philosophy was explicitly deterrent.
Deterrent.
Right. The economic theorists of the day believed that if you made state relief comfortable, it would destroy the incentive to work. Therefore, to get any help, you had to declare absolute destitution and enter the state-run workhouse.
And the workhouses were horrific.
Deliberately so. The architectural and operational design of the workhouse was engineered to be worse than the lowest possible standard of independent living outside of it.
So the government's policy was essentially making the safety net out of barbed wire, so no one would want to fall into it?
That is the perfect functional analogy for the 1834 Poor Law, a barbed wire safety net. They separated husbands from wives and parents from children.
Right.
They enforced grueling, pointless labor, like picking oakum or breaking stones. They wanted to ensure that falling into it was so painful that people would do literally anything to avoid it.
It sounds like they blamed the poor for being poor. I mean, assuming anyone could just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, completely ignoring trade depressions and sweated labor. It reminds me of Samuel Smiles and his books.
Oh, exactly, the Samuel Smiles ideology. His books, like Self-Help and Thrift, were massive bestsellers in the Victorian era. And you have to understand this prevailing ideology to see why the public allowed this harshness. The Victorians worshipped the self-made industrialist.
Right.
The laissez-faire economic theory held that success was the direct result of hard work and thrift. Consequently, poverty was viewed not as an economic systemic failure, but as a moral failing.
A failure of character.
Precisely. The culture largely assumed that if someone was starving, they simply hadn't worked hard enough. And of course, as historians note, this ignores the reality of horrific, sweated labor, where women were paid pennies to sew shirts 14 hours a day in unventilated rooms. We're not taking a stance on the politics of laissez-faire capitalism here, but rather just reporting how Heasman documents this ideological mindset and how it created a vacuum.
Right. So if the state's solution was just to build a taller, sharper fence around the workhouse, The structural collapse of these slums was inevitable. Someone had to break the prevailing economic doctrine of the time to actually intervene, and that intervention didn't come from economists or politicians.
No, it came from theology.
This is where the evangelicals step into the vacuum. And to clarify the scope of the source material for you listening, evangelicals in this Victorian context is not referred to as single church denomination, right?
Right. It refers to an interdenominational movement defined by a shared mindset. They encompass the Low Church of England, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Quakers, and Congregationalists.
It's a broad coalition.
Very broad. Their unifying theology was a belief in salvation by faith and an overriding focus on the authority of the scriptures.
And the sheer scale of their mobilization is what really stood out to me. The text estimates that this specific group was responsible for roughly 3/4 of the total number of voluntary charitable organizations operating in the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, 3/4.
3/4 of the civic safety net was being built by one theological demographic. That is massive.
It is, and we can actually trace the operational roots of this movement back to the turn of the century to an influential group known as the Clapham sect.
Ah, Wilberforce and Shaftesbury.
Exactly. The Clapham sect included wealthy figures like William Wilberforce and Lord Shaftesbury, and they were essentially the pioneers of modern civic PR campaigns.
Right. They weren't just quietly handing out alms. They were utilizing the modern printing press and distribution networks.
Yes, they funded mass lectures, printed thousands of pamphlets, and bought billboard space to sway public opinion on massive issues. Things like the abolition of the slave trade and the implementation of factory safety legislation.
So they basically established the playbook for philanthropic lobbying.
They did. And their legacy directly passed down to the next generation. Highly influential figures in our story, like Florence Nightingale and Josephine Butler, were literally the children or close associates of that original Clapham sect circle.
Oh, that's interesting.
But as the century progressed, the movement evolved from top-down political lobbying into direct street-level action.
And that pivot is largely driven by the arrival of D.L. Moody, the American revivalist, right?
Yes.
Because here's where it gets really interesting. If you are D.L. Moody, you aren't just relying on spontaneous emotion. You're essentially building a political campaign ground game.
Oh, completely. Moody fundamentally changed the mechanics of revivalism in Britain during his campaigns in the 1870s and 80s. He didn't just want private spiritual conversions. He demanded that his converts take immediate physical action against the destitution and crimes surrounding them.
He applied industrial era logistics to theology.
That's a great way to put it. He planned these campaigns like military operations. Months before he arrived in a city, his teams were booking halls, running fundraising networks, and most importantly, deploying workers to canvass the local slums.
The data collection.
Exactly. They gathered data on the specific localized problems of a neighborhood so that the intervention could be targeted.
But to staff this massive logistical operation, they needed a new workforce. They couldn't rely solely on wealthy aristocrats anymore, right?
Right. The scale was too big.
They had to mobilize the middle class, particularly middle-class women, and to do that, they built what I can only describe as a Victorian fiction engine.
Yes. The use of literature was highly strategic. Best-selling emotional fiction and memoirs became the primary recruitment tool.
Books like Jessica's First Prayer by Heasma Stretton, which told the story of a homeless girl in the city. That book sold an astonishing 1.5 million copies.
A massive bestseller.
And Mrs. Ranyard's The Missing Link. These books basically functioned as viral documentaries. They took the grim statistical realities of the slum and packaged them into compelling, emotional narratives that landed right on the drawing room tables of the comfortable middle class.
They served as immersive case studies. They accurately detailed the exact conditions of the submerged 10th, breaking the geographic isolation between the wealthy suburbs and the inner-city rookeries.
Right.
And the implicit message to the middle-class reader was clear. This suffering is happening just a few miles from your house, and your theology demands that you intervene.
And it worked. The capital flowing into these charities was immense. But, the mechanics of how that money was allocated is bizarre to a modern reader.
The voting charities.
Yes. The text dives into the concept of voting charities. Wait, Is this really how they worked? Rich donors basically ran a popularity contest where the poor had to beg them for their votes to get charity.
It sounds wild now, but yes, if you are a donor, you essentially get to treat charity like a shareholder proxy vote. If a family in the slums needed a spot in an orphanage for their child, they couldn't just apply to an administrator. They had to physically canvass the wealthy subscribers, begging them for their individual votes.
That is incredibly paternalistic.
It was. And it was deeply tied to the Victorian desire for public recognition of their benevolence. The large subscribers wanted their names printed in the annual reports, and they frankly enjoyed the power dynamic of the poor petitioning them directly.
Right.
However, if we look at the underlying economic engine there, that system unintentionally created a highly efficient free market competition among the charities themselves.
Oh, because the donors, who were often ruthless Victorian businessmen, wanted a return on their philanthropic investment.
What's fascinating here is how spiritual motivation combined with Victorian business efficiency. If a charity was bloated, inefficient, or failed to show actual results in getting children off the street, the businessmen pulled their money and their votes and moved them to a competing mission.
Wow.
So while the voting charity system was fueled by ego, it functioned as a ruthless auditing mechanism. It weeded out the incompetent organizations and funneled capital toward the missions that were actually innovating.
That is fascinating. But that brings us to the operational bottleneck, because the evangelicals had the capital and they had the motivation. But you can't just throw money at a slum and expect a structured safety net to spontaneously assemble.
No, you need boots on the ground.
Which leads to the invention of the professional social worker. Because up until the mid-19th century, the standard model of charity was, well, the lady visitor, right?
Right, the lady visitor.
Yeah.
A wealthy woman in a silk dress would take a carriage to the edge of the slum, drop off a food basket and a religious tract, and leave.
Which was wildly ineffective.
Completely.
Yeah.
Because the wealthy had no cultural context for the lives of the people they were trying to help. They were speaking entirely different languages.
Enter Mrs. Ranyard. She recognized this failure of communication in the slums of St. Giles. She realized that dropping a wealthy aristocrat into a rookery was tactically useless. So she developed the concept of the Bible women.
Yes.
And for the very first time, poor working-class women living in the slums are hired and paid a daily wage to perform localized social work.
And paying them a wage, even just a few pence a day, was a radical shift. It acknowledged that social work was labor, not just a hobby for the rich. These women became the critical missing link between the vast capital of the donors and the extreme hidden poverty of the slums.
The sources provide case studies of these women that show incredible tactical brilliance. Take Martha, for example. She was assigned to work among the massive dust heaps of Paddington.
Right.
Her entire flock consisted of women whose daily job was literally sifting through the city's trash to salvage cinders and bones. And Martha recognized that handing them a religious tract was pointless. Their immediate crushing need was dignity.
Exactly.
So she focused her efforts on securing a change of clean clothes for them so they could occasionally shed the identity of the dust heap and just feel human.
Martha understood the psychology of her environment perfectly. And similarly, we see Priscilla operating in Limehouse among the incredibly rough dock workers. Priscilla wasn't chosen for her theological debate skills.
No.
She was chosen because she was a highly skilled needlewoman. She leveraged that practical skill to teach the dockers' wives how to mend and construct clothes.
Which earns their trust.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Earning their trust opened the door to deeper welfare interventions. It's the birth of targeted, culturally competent casework.
But the movement didn't rely solely on working-class intuition, right? They also began rigorously training middle-class women.
Yes, the deaconess institutions.
Right. The Mildmay Deaconess Institution, founded in 1860 by Mrs. Pennefather, is a prime example. She looked at the enthusiasm of these middle-class volunteers and realized that good intentions without practical skill often caused more harm than good.
Oh, absolutely. So she established a highly structured training home. Women were subjected to a rigorous curriculum covering practical nursing, sanitation, and social casework techniques.
And the pragmatism of her approach is really evident in her uniform design.
I love this detail.
Yeah, because at the time, anti-Catholic prejudice was rampant in Protestant England. If a woman walked into an East End slum wearing anything resembling a nun's habit, she risked being physically attacked or chased out.
Right. So Mrs. Pennefather explicitly designed the deaconess uniforms to look like ordinary, neat civilian clothing, ensuring they had unimpeded access to the people they needed to treat.
That tactical awareness is what allowed these trained workers to build the giant Christian missions, which essentially functioned as localized shadow governments providing civic services.
They really did.
But it's fascinating to see the ideological debates playing out in how these missions were run. We see two distinct philosophies of intervention.
Yeah, the contrast is stark. On one side, you have the Field Lane Institution in Clerkenwell. Their approach was highly analytical and selective. They built massive dormitories for homeless men and women, but their ultimate goal was workforce reintegration.
Right, getting them jobs.
So they rigorously screened applicants, turning away the chronically idle to focus their resources entirely on the deserving poor who demonstrated a willingness to work.
They were running a highly curated employment pipeline, but contrast that with the South London mission run by William Carter. Carter's backstory is incredible. He was a former chimney sweep who experienced a religious conversion.
Right.
His approach to charity was absolute, unconditional alleviation of suffering. He instituted zero selection criteria. He didn't care if you were a drunkard, a thief, or undeserving. If you were hungry, his mission fed you.
And this encapsulates the core tension of early social work, doesn't it? Do you use aid as a lever for moral reform, or do you provide unconditional relief based solely on human need?
Yeah, that's the big question. And while they navigated that tension, they also had to confront the physical landscape of the slums, which brings up the wonderful paradox of Fred Charrington.
Oh, Fred Charrington.
I mean, the irony here, Charrington was the heir to a massive, highly lucrative brewing empire. Yet, driven by his evangelical convictions, he abandons the family fortune, sets up the Tower Hamlets mission in the East End, and dedicates his life to actively warring against the publicans and gin palaces.
The heir to a beer fortune is out on the streets trying to dismantle the local alcohol economy. It speaks to the absolute life-altering conviction driving the movement.
It really does.
But if we connect this back to the broader picture and look at the operational structure of all these various missions, we find a fundamental unifying principle that modern social work later lost and is only now trying to rediscover. These missions did not operate in silos. They didn't just run a soup kitchen for hungry men or an orphanage for abandoned children. They established maternity societies, coal clubs, sewing classes, and social evenings all under one roof. They treated the entire family as a single interconnected unit.
Wow, that is a critical structural insight. Because they understood that if the father is spending the family income at the pub, the child starves. If the mother lacks a maternity safety net and falls ill, the entire domestic economy collapses.
Exactly. As social work professionalized and entered the halls of government in the 20th century, it became highly compartmentalized. We built separate, disconnected bureaucracies for child welfare, addiction recovery, and housing assistance. We essentially fractured the family unit in our attempt to treat it scientifically.
Right.
But the Victorian amateurs, out of sheer pragmatic necessity, recognized that holistic, family-centric intervention was the only model that actually sustained long-term recovery.
That's amazing. But despite the brilliance of the Bible women and the massive scale of these holistic missions, the historical data shows that by the 1880s, the flood of poverty was still rising.
It was.
The population growth and the depths of the economic depressions were simply outpacing their resources. The philanthropic infrastructure was buckling. It was time for a radical escalation.
Which triggers a massive paradigm shift in 1883.
The publication of The Bitter Cry of Outcast London.
Yes.
This pamphlet, written by the London Congregational Union, functioned like an ideological earthquake. The opening lines are a brutal indictment of their own movement. Let me read this. Whilst we have been building our churches and solacing ourselves with our religion and dreaming that the millennium was coming, the poor have been growing poorer, and the wretched more miserable, and the immoral more corrupt.
It's a heavy admission.
The gulf has been daily widening, which separates the lowest classes of the community from our churches and chapels and from all decency and civilization.
It was a very public admission of failure. It forced the realization that passing out tracts and running soup kitchens was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. And this realization birthed the forward movement, spearheaded by the Methodist leader Hugh Price Hughes.
And Hughes initiates a profound theological shift.
He really does. If you are Hugh Price Hughes, you are looking at the data and realizing that individual salvation is insufficient when the structural environment guarantees failure. Hughes argues that Christ came to save society itself, not just pluck individuals out of the fire.
Right. This is the birth of the evangelical critique of systemic poverty.
Exactly. And Hughes operationalized this theology by taking over St. James Hall in Piccadilly. This was an area dense with theaters, extreme wealth, and hidden, crushing poverty. Hughes didn't just build a larger chapel, he built a civic infrastructure hub.
He effectively built a shadow local government. St. James's Hall housed an employment bureau to directly intervene in the casual labor market. They established a specialized field for crippled children. And most innovatively, they set up an inquiry office staffed by volunteers to offer free legal and practical advice to the poor.
Right.
They were helping illiterate citizens navigate predatory landlords and labor disputes. This was arguably the first modern citizens' advice bureau.
Yes, it was the blueprint. And as Hughes was building this civic hub, the Booths were mobilizing their forces. William and Catherine Booth founded what became the Salvation Army, alongside its Anglican counterpart, the Church Army.
Right.
And the Booths recognized that the traditional language and aesthetic of the church was completely alien to the submerged 10th.
So they adopt a military framework. They use brass bands, uniforms, military ranks. It was spectacular, loud, and immediately understandable to an uneducated population.
Exactly. But in the late 1880s, the Salvation Army makes a hard pivot from pure evangelism into highly structured, industrialized social work.
Which culminates in the publication of two massive competing manifestos in 1890, right?
Yeah.
The Church Army's Our Tramps and William Booth's incredibly famous In Darkest England and The Way Out.
Both organizations looked at the systemic failure of the government workhouses and proposed radical, incredibly ambitious, three-tier systems designed to completely eradicate destitution.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of this three-tier pipeline because it is a breathtaking piece of logistical engineering. Tier 1 was the city shelters.
Right.
They recognized the biological reality that a starving man cannot process moral or educational reform, so they opened massive, highly efficient shelters providing immediate, unconditional food and a clean bed. Within months, the Salvation Army was processing and sheltering thousands of bodies every single night.
But they knew the city itself was a toxic environment for recovery.
Yeah.
So Tier 2 involved the creation of farm training colonies. They leveraged massive amounts of donor capital to purchase agricultural land out in the countryside, such as the Salvation Army's colony at Hadley in Essex.
Right.
The objective was to extract men from the slum environment entirely, physically rehabilitate them with fresh air and steady food, and retrain them in agricultural labor.
And Tier 3 was organized, international immigration. They took these newly healthy, retrained individuals, chartered ships, and sent them to the overseas colonies like Canada or Australia to start completely fresh, free from the stigma of their past.
It was an end-to-end supply chain for human rehabilitation.
But naturally, this level of ambition faced severe backlash.
Oh, massive backlash. The Charity Organization Society, which represented the old, strict, deserving poor philosophy, launched vicious attacks against the armies. They argued that providing cheap food and beds such a massive scale was destroying the local economy and incentivizing vagrancy.
They were terrified. The armies were just enabling an army of tramps.
Yes, so the armies had to prove they weren't just running a massive handout machine. And their solution to this was a mechanism called the elevators.
The elevators. Explain that.
The elevators were a stroke of logistical genius. Attached to the city shelters were massive workshops, carpentry shops, paper sorting facilities, match factories. When a destitute man came to the shelter, he wasn't just handed a bed. He was immediately integrated into the elevator.
Oh, I see.
He worked in the shops to earn his keep while the organization searched for permanent outside employment.
That is brilliant. It solves multiple problems simultaneously. It generated revenue to offset the massive costs of the shelters. It served as an auditing mechanism to test a man's actual willingness to work. And crucially, it preserved the psychological dignity of the individual. They weren't beggars. They were earning their bread.
Exactly. Now, if the adult population was struggling to survive this environment, the children were the absolute most vulnerable victims.
Tragically, yes.
This forces us to examine how these Victorian innovators completely dismantled and rebuilt the concept of child welfare.
And to appreciate the innovation, we have to look at the baseline. If a child was orphaned in the early 19th century, the state solution was the 18th century asylum model. Think of a cold, cavernous stone building. The mechanics of these asylums were designed around industrial efficiency, not human development. Children were stripped of their individual identities, forced into coarse, identical uniforms, subjected to brutal corporal punishment, and trained exclusively for menial, repetitive labor.
It was essentially a penal colony for the crime of being orphaned.
Exactly.
And the evangelical organizations, groups like the National Children's Home, the Waste and Stray Society, and ultimately Dr. Barnardo's, they looked at this model and realized It was psychologically destroying the children. They pioneered a complete paradigm shift, the family unit model.
The operational scaling of Dr. Barnardo's empire is one of the most fascinating logistical stories in the text.
It's an incredible story.
Because Thomas Barnardo didn't set out to start orphanages. He was a young medical student planning to become a missionary in China. He was running a small, ragged school in the East End when a homeless boy named Jim Jarvis showed him the hidden reality of London. Jarvis led Barnardo onto the rooftops and into the gutters to show him hundreds of children sleeping in the freezing rain. And that singular visual completely derailed Barnardo's plans for China.
But how he established his first major foothold in the East End demonstrates incredible tactical audacity.
Yeah, he didn't rent a quiet chapel. He identified a massive, notorious gin palace and music hall called the Edinburgh Castle. It was a nucleus of violence and alcoholism in the neighborhood.
And he buys it.
Right. Barnardo leverages his donor network, outright purchases the entire complex, and functionally flips it. He strips out the alcohol, transforms it into a massive, well-lit coffee palace, and builds his mission center inside the shell of the old gin palace.
It was a hostile takeover of the local vice infrastructure, and his orphanage system grew entirely organically out of that center.
Because of the sheer volume of starving children knocking on the doors of the Edinburgh Castle, it just forced his hand. He instituted a radical operational policy. No destitute child ever refused admission.
But to manage that influx, without reverting to the barracks model, Barnardo and his contemporaries had to invent decentralized care.
Right.
Instead of building one massive warehouse for children, they began purchasing normal residential houses. They would place a trained mother and father in charge of a small group of 10 to 15 children, effectively simulating a normal, healthy family environment.
They were engineering the blueprint for the modern foster care and group home systems.
Exactly. And while Barnardo was rescuing the visible street children, another entirely invisible demographic was dying in the dark. The text goes into deep detail regarding the crippled and handicapped children of the slums.
Right, because the state provided absolutely zero infrastructure for them. They couldn't physically access the schools, and the prevailing culture viewed physical disability with intense shame.
Yeah, these children were routinely hidden away by their families in the darkest, unventilated corners of the rookeries, completely cut off from the outside world.
And the catalyst for change was data collection. In 1888, a man named Charles Boyer decided to map the actual scale of the problem. He conducted a painstaking door-to-door survey in the East End to count the hidden, homebound, crippled children. The statistical reality he uncovered was staggering.
It was. He took this data to the Shaftesbury Society and demanded intervention. Under the operational direction of Margaret Coles, they mobilized a specialized network of visitors to seek these children out.
But what fascinates me is that they didn't just drop off medical supplies. They recognized that these children were dying of psychological isolation as much as physical ailments, so they engineered a system of cripples' parlors.
And the logistics of this were immense. They organized transport to physically fetch these hidden children from their slum rooms, children who had never seen the sky outside their alleyway, and bring them to brightly lit parlors for specialized education, games, and social interaction.
Wow.
They even organized massive logistical operations to take trains full of disabled children on excursions to the seaside.
It is an incredible logistical feat. However, as modern readers, we have to grapple with the methods they use to fund and normalize this.
Right.
The text details the creation of the Crutch and Kindness League. This was an organization where wealthy, middle-class children were assigned a disabled slum child and tasked with mailing them toys and magazines. I mean, it's amazing they did this, but wasn't it incredibly patronizing? It feels dangerously close to poverty tourism, utilizing disabled children as props to teach rich kids how to be benevolent.
It is absolutely dripping with Victorian paternalism, and it reflects their rigid belief in a divinely ordained class hierarchy. But if we evaluate their actions against the reality of the 1880s, we have to acknowledge what they achieved.
It's a fair point.
Before the Shaftesbury Society, a crippled child in a slum was a non-entity. They were invisible. The Evangelicals, whatever their paternalistic flaws, were the first demographic in British society to use their political and financial capital to loudly insist that these children had inherent human value.
They broke the seal of invisibility.
Exactly. They established the foundational idea that a handicapped child has a right to education, joy, and societal inclusion.
They shattered the taboo. And speaking of wading into the taboo, The evangelicals didn't limit their interventions to innocent children. They boldly waded into the most dangerous, highly stigmatized arenas of Victorian society, the sex trade and the criminal justice system.
The Victorian approach to prostitution was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The economy relied on vast numbers of underpaid women, and the military maintained massive garrisons of soldiers, creating a rampant sex trade. Yet society entirely ostracized the women involved, treating them as irredeemable criminals while ignoring the economic drivers.
This makes the mechanics of the midnight meeting movement in the 1850s so astonishing. We're talking about middle-class men and women deliberately navigating the most dangerous, violent streets of London at midnight.
Yes.
They didn't wait for women to come to a chapel. They physically walked into the locked venereal disease wards of the hospitals. They navigated the pitch-black slum lodging houses, and they literally walked through the doors of the brothels.
It was incredibly dangerous face-to-face intervention. And they weren't just handing out tracts. They had an operational pipeline ready. They offered immediate extraction to temporary shelters, followed by placement in specialized training homes where the women could learn a sustainable trade.
Like laundry work or domestic service, right?
So they could re-enter the legitimate economy.
We see a similar radical intervention regarding unmarried mothers. The cruelty of the state system here is hard to overstate. If a destitute, unmarried woman gave birth, the state forced her into the workhouse infirmary, routinely placing her in beds right next to hardened criminals and prostitutes.
And the economic reality was even worse. If the mother wanted to leave the workhouse and find employment, she was usually forced to farm out her infant to a wet nurse or a baby farmer.
Baby farming.
Yes. In the unregulated slums, baby farmers were paid a lump sum to take the child, creating a direct financial incentive to neglect the infant. Baby farming was very often a death sentence.
But then you have specialized interventions like the Anchorage Mission, started in 1882, and Mrs. Maine's Refuge for Deserted Mothers from 1864. They looked at the baby farming mortality rates and instituted a revolutionary operational policy. They insisted on keeping the mother and the baby together.
Yeah.
They provided safe, private housing for the birth and maintained that housing for months afterward. This allowed the mother to physically recover, bond with the infant, and secure safe employment that accommodated the child.
They recognized the biological human bond over the societal moral judgment.
And that exact same impulse, the willingness to look past the moral judgment of the state and see the systemic trap the human was caught in, led to one of the most consequential interventions in the entire text.
Oh, definitely.
I want to tee up one of the most incredible stories here, because what does this all mean for our modern legal system? This next sequence of events literally rewrote the legal code of the Western world. So how does a working-class painter in 1876 fundamentally alter the mechanics of the criminal justice system?
It starts with Frederick Rayner, a working-class painter from Hertfordshire. Rayner spent time observing the daily operations of the local police courts, and he was deeply horrified by the mechanics of the justice system. The police courts were essentially a high-speed conveyor belt of misery.
Imagine the sensory environment of a Victorian police court. It's a damp, freezing room. The holding cells smell of gin, unwashed bodies, and despair. And the magistrate is sitting at the bench, tasked with processing hundreds of cases a week.
Right.
Most of these cases aren't master criminals. They are people arrested for public drunkenness, or stealing a loaf of bread, or petty vandalism driven by sheer desperation.
And the magistrate's legal toolkit was entirely binary. You either exact a fine, which the poor could never pay, or you threw them in the overcrowded jail.
And the jail time only ensured they lost whatever casual employment they had, guaranteeing they would reoffend upon release. The text highlights a specific, tragic metric Rayner observed: a 24-year-old woman who had been charged and processed through that court 150 times.
At 24 years old, to have survived 150 cycles of the prison conveyor belt. It's tragic.
Rayner looks at this systemic failure, realizes the punitive model is bankrupt, and he mails a 5-shilling donation to the Church of England Temperance Society.
Which was a significant chunk of a painter's wages.
Exactly. He included a letter begging the society to deploy someone directly into the courts to break the cycle.
And the society actually deployed a man. That 5-shilling donation funded the very first police court missionary.
But how did the missionary actually physically intervene in the legal process? He couldn't just stand in the gallery and preach at the judge.
No, the intervention was highly procedural. The missionary negotiated access to the holding cells before the magistrate even took the bench. He would walk among the prisoners, identifying the first-time offenders, the youth, or those simply trapped by alcoholism.
Okay.
He would interview them, gather data on their families, their employment, and their living conditions.
So when the court is in session and a first-time offender is standing in the dock terrified, the missionary physically steps forward. He addresses the magistrate, presenting the data he gathered.
Right.
And then he leverages a legal loophole. He asks the magistrate to defer the sentence, promising that if the prisoner is released into his custody, he will take personal, physical responsibility for their rehabilitation.
And the magistrate is staring at a broken system, and suddenly a third party offers a viable alternative to the prison cell. The magistrate agrees to remand the case.
The missionary becomes the supervisor.
Yes. He visits the offender's home, helps secure employment, and monitors their sobriety.
And the success rate of this grassroots ad hoc supervision was so statistically undeniable that the government was forced to recognize it.
They had to.
This precise mechanic, the missionary standing in the court, became the explicit legal foundation for the Probation of First Offenders Act of 1887, and eventually the Probation of Offenders Act of 1907.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a 5-shilling donation invented the modern probation officer.
It's amazing.
The entire legal concept of suspended sentences, community supervision, and rehabilitative justice was engineered in those freezing, gin-soaked holding cells by volunteers who refused to accept the state's binary system of punishment.
It is the ultimate proof that massive systemic change can be engineered from the bottom up. Okay, so we've explored the structural innovations in the homes, the streets, and the courts. But the evangelical net extended even further.
It did.
They looked at the economic engine of the empire itself and realized that the physical realities of specific trades were acting as meat grinders, destroying the bodies of the workers. They began mapping occupational hazards long before the government established workplace safety regulations.
Yeah, because the healthcare infrastructure for the working class was virtually non-existent.
Right.
If a worker was injured, they couldn't afford a private doctor. The provident dispensaries required a regular weekly membership fee, which a casual laborer couldn't maintain. That left only the overcrowded, chaotic outpatient wards of the major hospitals or the dreaded workhouse doctor.
This complete lack of access triggers the invention of the medical missions.
Dr. William Burns Thompson is the pioneer here. In 1859, he is operating in the Cowgate slum of Edinburgh. He realizes that you can't expect a sick, starving worker to navigate across the city to a hospital. You have to embed the medical infrastructure directly into the slum.
So, in a brilliant piece of adaptive reuse, he rents an old dram shop, a local pub, and converts it into a free medical dispensary.
He weaponized the geography of the slum. He transformed a hub of alcoholism into a center of healing.
I love that.
And Dr. Thompson used this clinic to train medical students in identifying and treating the specific pathologies of extreme poverty. Furthermore, he established a dispatch system, sending doctors and nurses directly into the unventilated rooms of patients who were physically unable to walk to the clinic.
And the data generated by Thompson's pub clinic proved so effective that Dr. William Fairley Clark exported the entire operational model to London in the 1870s, rapidly scaling a network of free medical missions across the East End. But the Evangelicals didn't just build static clinics. They deployed mobile interventions to target specific, highly vulnerable labor populations. Consider the navvies.
The navvies.
Yeah.
The navigators. They were the massive mobile army of manual laborers who physically carved out the railways and canals of the British Empire.
They were the muscle of the industrial age, but sociologically they operated as an entirely isolated subculture. The text refers to them as Ishmaelites, a population with their hand against every man.
Right.
Because they had to follow the construction lines, they lived in temporary, lawless shanty towns constructed of mud and turf. They were completely severed from normal civic infrastructure, making them heavily prone to explosive violence and alcoholism.
Yet, in the 1850s, when 3,000 navvies descended on Sydenham to construct the Crystal Palace, Catherine Marsh simply walks into their encampment.
Which is wild.
It is. Marsh's intervention is a masterclass in establishing authority without force. She didn't arrive with police backing. She simply set up reading rooms, offered to write letters home for illiterate men, and provided a stabilizing, civilizing presence in a hypermasculine, volatile environment. She became a localized welfare administrator for an entire transient town.
And we see a similar, highly practical intervention targeting the cab drivers of London. If you analyze the occupational reality of a Victorian cab driver, it is brutal.
Oh, incredibly brutal.
You were sitting completely exposed on the box of a horse-drawn cab in the freezing rain and toxic fog of London for 12 to 14 hours a day.
And the occupational hazard here wasn't just the weather, it was the biological necessity of survival. Between fares, the only place a driver could legally secure a warm fire, a hot meal, or a restroom was the local public house.
The infrastructure of their job essentially forced them to consume alcohol to survive the shift.
Exactly. Recognizing this structural trap, the Earl of Shaftesbury and a coalition of reformers launched the Cabmen's Shelter Fund in 1875. They engineered a brilliant architectural solution. They built small, distinctive green wooden shelters and placed them directly on the cab ranks in the middle of the streets.
Which is so smart.
These shelters provided a blazing stove, hot coffee, and cheap hot steaks at all hours of the day and night. They surgically removed the reliance on the gin palace by providing a superior logistical alternative.
And remarkably, you can still find several of these historic green shelters operating on the streets of London today. It was an elegant solution to a complex occupational hazard. But if the cabbies endured a harsh environment, the populations that truly operated on the edge of the abyss were the sailors and the soldiers.
Yeah, the isolation of the maritime trades was profound. The text highlights the deep-sea fishermen, specifically the fleets operating in the brutal conditions of the North Sea. These men were out on the water for weeks at a time.
And if a man got his arm crushed in a steam winch or suffered severe frostbite, there was no medical infrastructure. He had to survive in agony until a ship returned to port.
To combat this, figures like E.J. Mather and later the legendary Dr. Wilfred Grenfell engineered maritime medical rescue. They raised the capital to purchase fishing smacks and completely retrofitted them into floating hospitals.
Those hospital ships sailed with the fishing fleets. If an injury occurred in a storm, the medical infrastructure was already on site, drastically reducing mortality and amputation rates.
Yes. And back on land, the military garrisons presented their own toxic ecosystem. Soldiers were subjected to brutal discipline and low pay, and when they were granted leave, they were immediately preyed upon by the massive networks of brothels and predatory canteens that surrounded the barrack towns.
So two remarkable women, Miss Robinson and Miss Sandys, analyzed this predatory ecosystem and decided to build a competing infrastructure. They established massive soldiers' institutes right outside the gates of the major barracks. These were essentially massive dry clubs featuring reading rooms, game halls, and cheap food, providing the soldiers with a safe psychological decompression zone that didn't require them to get drunk.
And their operational analysis extended beyond the soldiers to the military families. The British Army at the time only recognized a very small percentage of marriages as being on the strength.
Meaning officially approved.
Yes. If a soldier married without official permission, his wife and children received zero state support or transport. When the regiment deployed overseas, these unrecognized families were left behind to literally starve in the garrison towns.
The intervention here required massive logistical coordination. The evangelical reformers established networks to track and support these abandoned families, an effort that directly evolved into SSAFA, the Soldiers and Sailors Family Association.
They provided nursing, emergency financial aid, and employment assistance to the dependents of the military. SSAFA remains a massive, vital military charity operating to this very day.
If you look at the connective tissue of all these trade interventions, the navvy camps, the cab ranks, the military garrisons, an incredible sociological pattern emerges. These were highly dangerous, violent, exclusively male-dominated environments.
Right.
Yet the architects who successfully tamed these spaces, established order, and built the welfare infrastructure were almost entirely middle-class women. They somehow managed to establish authority and act as comprehensive social caseworkers.
It is one of the most significant historical takeaways from this era. Victorian society systematically excluded women from formal political power, from the legal system, and from the professional bureaucracies.
Yeah.
However, society deemed charity to be an acceptable feminine pursuit.
Ah, I see.
Therefore, these highly educated, brilliant women channeled all of their suppressed administrative genius into the voluntary sector. Under the guise of simple charity, they were managing massive budgets, coordinating complex logistics, deploying personnel, and essentially running shadow bureaucracies.
They couldn't run for parliament, so they built the welfare state instead.
Exactly.
Let's pull all of these threads together to synthesize this massive deep dive. We started our journey in the terrifying structural collapse of the Victorian rookeries. We watched a government deliberately build a safety net out of barbed wire. And into that void stepped a chaotic, highly motivated army of evangelical volunteers. Driven by theology, they utilized everything from viral fiction to pub conversions to completely rewire the civic infrastructure of the British Empire. They gave us the professional social worker, the foster care system, community probation, and occupational health.
The foundation they laid is undeniable. However, as an analyst evaluating the historical record, we must address the primary critique leveled against the evangelicals by modern historians and sociologists.
And we're not taking sides here, but just looking at the historical critique.
Exactly. The enduring critique is that this massive army of volunteers spent decades aggressively treating the symptoms, the starvation, the alcoholism, the disease, while utterly failing to attack the underlying disease. And that disease, in the eyes of these critics, was a system of unchecked, exploitative capitalism that structurally required a desperate, starving underclass to function.
So the critique is that they were heroes at pulling drowning people out of the river, but they refused to walk upstream to confront the industrialists who were throwing the people into the river in the first place.
Exactly. They alleviated the suffering without dismantling the engine that caused it. However, a close reading of the later chapters of the source material reveals that this critique is not entirely absolute. Because as the century closed, the very people working in these slum missions began to synthesize the data they were collecting. Figures like Hugh Price Hughes and the leaders of the Christian labor movement realized that philanthropy was mathematically insufficient.
They started looking at the bigger picture.
They did. They began weaponizing their data to agitate for structural, systemic changes. They lobbied the state for housing regulations, minimum wage boards, and eventually the implementation of state-funded old-age pensions.
Which shows a huge evolution in thought. Their legacy is a dual triumph. They provided the immediate, desperate tactical relief that kept millions alive, and the operational methods they invented became the exact blueprints the government used when it finally accepted responsibility and built the modern welfare state.
They engineered the prototype. The state simply scaled it.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought regarding where we are today. In the 21st century, we rely heavily on the state to provide the massive, highly engineered safety nets that these Victorian volunteers built from scratch in the mud. We have professionalized and institutionalized charity.
We have.
But in handing these duties over to massive government bureaucracies, have we accidentally engineered out the one vital component the evangelicals insisted upon? Have we lost the relentless, highly personal, neighborly love for the individual? As we continue to build grander, more efficient systems for social welfare, it is deeply worth asking, how do we keep the human touch alive in the machinery of the state? Something to think about.
It remains the ultimate unresolved challenge of modern social administration.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our journey through the grimy, innovative streets of Victorian London. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of our safety net, and we'll see you next time.